Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review, finally, of the new Sony a7 IV. And I want to thank Sony Canada for getting me a loaner so I can spend some time with this camera and give you my final verdict on it. This obviously is probably Sony's most popular price point or model when it comes to their full frame options. And of course, the a7 III was a huge advance for the lineup and really was a really compelling camera on its own merit that compared favorably in a lot of different areas to even more expensive models. The same is going to be true here of the a7 IV, as while I think the a7 III inherited a lot of the technology that it pioneered on the a9, the a7 IV actually has the benefit of receiving a lot of trickle-down technology from the Sony Alpha 1, which is better still for obvious reasons. The a7 IV has a new 33 megapixel sensor, which I'm delighted about, an improved focus system, and a variety of other different aspects of functionality, including an articulating LCD screen that makes it, in its sum total, a whole lot better camera to use. And we're going to explore why as a part of today's review. First of all, however, I want to thank a new sponsor of this channel, eksterwallets. Today's episode is brought to you by Ekster, maker of fine smart wallets and other premium accessories. The Ekster Parliament wallet is slim and elegant, made from top grain leather, and has a built-in aluminum card holder that blocks RFID signals and fans out your cards at the click of a button for easy access. You can even add one of their slim, solar-powered Chipolo tracking cards if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Visit Ekster, that's ekster.com/Dustin Abbott, for a special discount off their beautifully crafted wallets, phone cases, and even laptop sleeves. Visit ekster.com/Dustin Abbott and find out why Forbes magazine calls Ekster the most successful smart wallet brand in the world. So we'll start by diving into what's new here and what is unchanged with a closer look at the build, features, and handling of the a7 IV. The Sony a7 IV is designed around a brand new 33 megapixel CMOS sensor. This ups the resolution from the 24 megapixels seen on previous A7 bodies and brings us to what I consider a sweet spot for performance. The body is largely familiar, but with a deeper grip depth that improves the feel of the camera in the hand. The a7 IV manages to be only 8 grams heavier than the a7 III. In many ways, the control layout feels like the Alpha 1, though the a7 IV has a welcome articulating touchscreen with a 1.037 million dot resolution that is a slight gain over the 922,000 dot resolution on the a7 III's tilting screen. The responsiveness of the screen is fairly good, though I do find the font size a little too small for touch precision at times and wish the menu layout was more like Canon's. Being able to front monitor and use the screen in nearly infinite positions is very welcome, as is being able to position the screen for proper vertical shooting. I love the way that Sony has designed the ports so they fit next to the hinges of the screen in a very logical way. They've even made room for a full-size HDMI port. Also improved is the resolution of the viewfinder, which has been upgraded from the 2.36 million dot resolution on the a7 III to a new 3.68 million dot resolution. It's worth noting that the viewfinder and LCD screen resolution figures are just the bare minimum for competitiveness, however, so don't get too excited. The top plate shows a few minor tweaks to the dials, along with a swapping of the C1 button to the back and the video record button to the top plate. For some reason, there is no longer a label on the exposure compensation dial, which I find odd. The right side of the camera holds the memory cards, and you now have the option to use a CF Express Type A card in the number 1 slot or a UHS-2 SD card in either slot. The burst rate is the familiar 10 frames per second, but the buffer depth has been dramatically improved, now allowing over 1,000 frames of lossless compressed RAWs or JPEGs, and even 828 full-size uncompressed RAW plus JPEG. Long gone are the delays while the camera empties the buffer, too. The hot shoe has been upgraded to Sony's new multi-interface port, which allows it to record digital audio when select mics are mounted. Other hidden improvements include a removal of the video recording limit and the ability to record up to 4K 60, though with a Super 35 crop. Also added is real-time bird AF tracking, along with human and animal eye tracking, even while recording video. So while the A7 IV may look very familiar, there are a lot of key upgrades that seriously improve the ergonomics and performance of the camera. I find a lot of the Alpha 1 DNA here, and a camera that is about a third of the price.
So let's talk autofocus. I'm filming with the A7 IV right now, so you get a little bit of sense of tracking during a segment like this. But like in other areas, the A7 IV has benefited from inheriting a lot of things from the Alpha 1, including the focus system. Just like we saw that the A7 III was a really strong autofocus camera because it inherited a lot of A9 technology, the A7 IV is even more so in that it's got a lot of the even more superior Alpha 1 technology. That includes a bump up from the 693 phase detect autofocus points we saw on previous A7 III to 759 phase detect points, and that's always backed up by 425 contrast AF points. That gives you a 94% sensor coverage, just like the Alpha 1 in that range. And so you really do have an incredible focus system. Not only do you get the incredible focus system from the Alpha 1, but you also get the same Bion Z XR processor that's found in the Alpha 1 and then also in the A9 Mark II, which means that you're not only getting a great autofocus detection, but you're also being able to process that information much more quickly than in previous models. Though I will note that in a camera that has a more limited frame rate like this camera, you're probably not going to push that processor all that hard. Still, better to be overpowered than underpowered when it comes to something like that. They've also added in the new bird eye detect, and in a little bit of a twist, you have access to real-time tracking for humans, animals, and birds in video mode as well, which was something that was not originally on the Alpha 1, though I fully expect to see it added via firmware at some point. Like the Alpha 1 also, sensitivity has gone from -3 EV down to -4 EV, which isn't necessarily a top-notch figure, but it has allowed me to shoot effectively even in very dim conditions. For example, the shot, which I shot inside my Regard dry cabinet, so I had to shoot at ISO 25,600. I was able to autofocus even in those very, very dim conditions. Now, where all of this kind of starts to slip is the very basic architecture of the camera relative to the A9 series or the Alpha 1. Those cameras are designed around an electronic shutter. And of course, one of the key features for tracking fast action is that it's a blackout-free experience. That's not the case here. So we're designed primarily around a mechanical shutter, and so the electronic shutter is more of an afterthought here and with specific applications. So for example, you can get up to 10 frames per second with real-time tracking. However, you're not getting a real-time viewfinder experience. Instead, you're almost getting like a storybook look where you see, for a split second, the previous image taken. You're not getting a real-time viewfinder experience. If you drop down to high instead of high plus mode, you get 8 frames per second, and then you get a real-time readout in the viewfinder, though it's still interrupted 8 times per second with the blackout when the shutter goes. You can go into electronic shutter. That seems to be limited at about 6 frames per second. But you still get the blackout for some reason, and so there really is no tracking scenario here where you're going to get the kind of blackout-free viewfinder experience that you get on the dedicated sports bodies. So that's a reminder that this is a jack-of-all-trades camera. It's not a dedicated sports camera, and I think that if you hammer it a little too hard in that area, you're not really using the camera to its potential. It's not really what it's designed for. And so I think that in a pinch, this is going to track very effectively. It's got all the tools to track effectively, but you probably won't find the tracking experience anything like the superior one that's found with the A9 series or the Alpha 1. But if you'll use this camera in its kind of sweet spot for general purpose shooting for portraiture, it really is amazing. I handed this camera to my assistant to take some pictures of me on a very cold day because I needed some portrait tests done, and he had never touched the A7 IV. He had never used the Samyang AF 50mm f1.4 Mark II lens that was mounted on it. We went out, I had him shoot backlit, I had him shoot through trees, I had him shoot in a variety of conditions. I came home, again, he's never used any of these these things before, but eye detect did its job, and I doubt he would even have known how to move the AF point around with this camera without spending a few times getting familiar, and yet every one of them was perfectly focused. And that is the advantage of a great focus system like this. You can shoot in a whole great variety of situations and get very effective autofocus results. And so we've got a great autofocus system here that is a nice evolution of what we saw in the already excellent A7 III before it.
It's been cold, really cold. Fortunately, that helps to solve the overheating issues of most cameras, but it's not really needed with the A7 IV. It has an improved thermal design that allows you to take advantage of the removed video recording limits. You can now record until your media card fills up, and Sony states that you can record even at 4K 60 for well over an hour without any heating issues. At 4K 30, you get full-frame 7K oversampling that allows for highly detailed 4K video without crop, though recording at 4K 60 requires shooting in a Super 35 crop factor. You can now shoot at 10-bit 422 and at a variety of file formats and bit rates. You also have access to a wide variety of picture profiles and advanced video options like S-Log3, HLG for HDR content, and even the S-Cinetone profile that I typically use on my videos with the Alpha 1. The in-body image stabilization now includes active mode, though I still find that getting smooth movement shots works best with a gimbal. The improvements to autofocus also apply to video, with real-time tracking of human, animal, and even bird subjects. There are a few new features to help with video capture, including a new focus map with a bright visual overlay to help you to show what is before the plane of focus in red and what is beyond in blue, with only the plane of focus showing without color. There's also a new focus compensation lens correction that, in theory, helps eliminate focus breathing. I tested it with the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master and noted that it made a mild improvement to focus breathing, but not a significant one, and it came with an obvious crop factor. It's still better to buy a lens with naturally low focus breathing, in my opinion. There's a lot of great stuff here for video, however, and the addition of the articulating LCD touchscreen should make this a top choice for many hybrid shooters. So finally, we're going to take a dive into the sensor performance. As noted, this is a brand new sensor, and I'm delighted at this particular resolution point, as it's one that I've long advocated for as kind of a sweet spot, which is far enough resolution for most people in most situations, but also not so high that you start to run into some of the limitations that come with high resolution bodies in terms of file storage, but also things like, a loss of high ISO performance and things like that. This really is, I think, going to be a sensor point that is going to appeal to a lot of people for a lot of reasons, as we'll see as we dive into it here. So we'll start by taking a look at our base ISO here and then take a look at how the camera performs throughout the ISO range. So here at base ISO, and I'm using for these tests using the Sony FE 50mm f1.4 planar lens, but you can see that we have got very nice looking color, great detail here in the frame, and then into our blacks and our shadows, everything is nice and clean, what you would expect at base level ISO. At ISO 800, if we compare to 100, we really can't see any difference. Everything is still very, very clean. Shadows look very clean. There's next to no visible noise, even at a pixel level, and so nothing to complain about there. Moving on to ISO 1600, we can still see that everything looks very similar to base ISO. You are losing very little at this point. There's a tiny bit of additional noise, but really not enough to really be able to hardly appreciate at all. At ISO 3200, everything is still looking very clean. Our contrast levels look good. Detail and information is there into the shadows, still looking nice and dark. Maybe not as inky black as what the base ISO, but and a little tiny bit of visible noise here. But you can see that there's no color blotching. Everything is very consistent in the shadowed area, and there's only a little bit of a fine noise that is showing up there. Overall, still a very clean looking result. And if you look at them at a global level, you really aren't going to be able to distinguish the ISO 3200 result from the ISO or base ISO result. You can see even at ISO 6400 on a global level, it's going to be very hard to distinguish these two results. Very, very clean looking. And if we jump on into a pixel level, you can see that there is starting to be a little bit more of a visible noise pattern, but really it's still very clean and very consistent out here. No discoloration, no kind of color blotches. And we can see here that our saturation levels are still quite good. And I don't think that there's been any kind of significant color shift here either. Likewise, at ISO 12800, again, you can see just a slightly increasing amount of noise, but overall things are very clean. You're starting to see just a little bit of different colored pixels out in the shadowed area, just a little bit of what looks like this white speckle. It's very, very subtle, however, and only noticeable at a pixel level. We can look down here, we can see that the noise is getting a little bit rougher, but still, you would have to look at that and say it's still a very clean looking result. ISO 25600 used to be the place where everything looked like absolute garbage. That is not the case anymore. Certainly, everything is starting to get rougher looking. There's more of that kind of lighter color pixel blotching out there. The visible noise is a little bit more obvious. But if we look over here on our main subjects, we can see the contrast still looks quite good. There is some visible noise, but nothing overly destructive. Again, looking at that on a global level, that's still a very usable shot. And while the saturation levels aren't quite as good as what they are at base ISO, basically the colors and the overall look of the image is similar. Now, if we compare globally 25,600 with 51,200, which is the native range limit, you will see there is a slight green shift that starts to take place here in this area here. This is the way that Sony sensors go. They tend to skew a little bit more towards the green as they reach their limits. It's subtle, but you can see that there is just a little bit of a tint that has come there, and you can see that comparatively the noise has gotten rougher. At the same time, however, your basic look of images is pretty similar. And if we look down here at the noise area, it's definitely rougher. And so you're starting to lose a little bit of contrast because of that, white pixelated noise that's coming in there. But at the same time, looking at things globally, I would have to say that's still a usable image under many circumstances. Now, if I move on to 1,000 or 102,400, you can definitely see compared to 25,600, which is our last kind of full stop where everything looks, very clean without any kind of color shift. You can definitely see that color shift even more here. And in fact, if I toggle here and I remove the 25,600 and replace it on the left with 51,200, you can see how much further a shift there is even comparing these two images. And if we go a step further, to the now extended maximum range of 204,800, you can really see that further discoloration that everything is there. And now you can see that even at a global level, the black levels are just shot. Their contrast is destroyed. And you can just see how huge that difference is there. I'm going to bump it back to a little slightly more practical 102,400. And you can see that, here it's not looking good. It's, and I would say that's only usable at an absolute emergency. I wouldn't call that normally usable, but I would look back at this by comparison and say there's certainly circumstances where this would work for you. I also wanted to give you a look at a real-world shot with no available light. I was just shooting in my actual lens cabinet here, and so I'm having to shoot at 25,600 and, shooting at, I think, about 1/50th of a second shutter speed. And so this is more of a real-world kind of test here, and I can say that it still, to me, looks very, very good. You can see, as we saw, some of that pixelated noise and those deep shadows. You can see some of the visible noise that is here, but lots of good detail, good contrast. The image is still very usable. So we're going to shift to a sequence where we begin to look at dynamic range. And so what will happen is here is the base ISO here on the left. On the right, you have an image that we're going to start with overexposure. So this has been overexposed by one stop. And so you can see how it's, looks overexposed. There's some blown out points. We're going to see how the camera sensor does at recovering those blown out areas. So I take that one stop of overexposure, I dial it back one stop here in post. You can see that we have very clean results. And so any of these areas where there's kind of a blown out spot, you can see that information has been recovered just fine. And so there is no lost information here, no lost detail, no problem thus far. If If we take that to 2 stops of overexposure here on the left and recover in post, we can see looking at our color swatches, we're recovering those colors still fine, no problem. We'll take a look in here at some of our really bright blown out spots, and you can see that that information has recovered just fine. There's no issues there. You know, the book cover still looks like it should after it's been recovered. Now, 3 stops of overexposure is typically the practical limit, and things start to fall apart there. And we can see here that this has actually done a better job than most, I would say. The timer face here still looks pretty credible to me, and that's usually something that starts to fall apart. Likewise, if we look at our color swatches, they've recovered quite nicely. And if we look here at this blown out area, the camera face is fine. There's a little bit of lost information here, but by and large, this is still looking pretty natural after a 3-stop recovery, which is a really, really good result. Now, I've never seen any camera survive the 4-stop overexposure, and this is not going to be the first. We can see, looking here now on the timer face, that color is lost. It's got an unnatural look to it because of so much lost information. Likewise, on the facade of the Pentax there, you can just see there's all kinds of information that's been lost where it's unnatural. Likewise, as we look at these color swatches, there's some colors that just didn't come back, and others where we can see just a weird bleeding effect where it's just unnatural in general. A cover of this book, information has been lost. And that's a more typical end result there at a 4-stop of overexposure. But the 3-stop of overexposure was a pleasant surprise. Now, if we start to go the other direction, here is just a 1-stop of underexposure. Modern cameras are really, really good at recovering shadows. And so we can see here that even though there's some areas here that were, kind of blown out and information was lost, we can see that that information is recovering just fine here. Everything looks nice and clean. At 2 stops of underexposure, we can see once again that information that's being lost is recovering just fine, and we see no extra noise that is being introduced. Everything here looks nice and clean. So again, a perfect result there. If we go to 3 stops of underexposure, you can see that there's lots of crushed shadows at this point, but we can see that they are recovering just fine, no visible noise. Our shadowed area still looks really nice and clean, and we look over here at the grip, all those textures are recovering just fine. Contrast looks good, colors still look very natural. At 4 stops of underexposure, you can see that almost all the information is really, really hooded here and lost. But we can see that once again, we're picking that information back up really cleanly. I'm not seeing any color shifting. I'm not seeing a lot of additional noise. In fact, noise is still almost non-existent over here. Contrast looks very good. That's a very impressive performance at 4 stops. Now, often with modern cameras, I'm finding the limit at about 5 stops of shadow recovery, and that's where things start to fall apart. I'm happy to report here, though, I'm not seeing any kind of color shifting. As we look at this information that was completely lost before, it's all recovering and in a pretty natural way as well. There is a little bit more of noise that's showing up here, but overall, this is still pretty consistent. I'm not seeing a lot of just crushed or lost information. That's a really, really impressive dynamic range performance. Probably one of the best that I've seen. What this means is out in the real world, you have got a lot of flexibility. So in this raw image, for example, I can pull down that highlight information. I get all the sky color back without any kind of natural or, noticeable hot spots. You can open up those shadows. Now, it's not necessarily a desirable effect necessarily here, but you can see into those shadows. There's lots of information that was crushed that we're able to bring right back by just opening up the shadows. And so, a strong performance there. Here's another image where you've got a lot of dynamic range, deep shadows, really blown out highlights here. But you can see by pulling down those highlights, all of that sky information just came right back, which is really impressive and in a very clean fashion. Here are the shadows. I don't really want to open them too much, but you could open up those shadows if you wanted. I prefer having a little bit more contrast in the image, but I've got the flexibility to do it. Here's another example here. So you have the ability, once again, to pull back the sky to your taste, to open up those shadows, to how much you want. Now, opening them all the way up is not, you have so much latitude here now that's not necessarily the desired effect. But, somewhere balance in between, what it does is it gives you control over how you're going to treat those shadows. I really like this particular resolution point, and so, when you have a good lens attached, you can see that as you look towards the distance, there's just lots of detailed information all throughout this frame. You know, as far as the eye can see, even at a pixel level, there's just I love the detail rendering. This is a very strong new sensor. Likewise, for shooting portraits here, we can see that obviously we saw a very good, consistency in terms of focus. But you can also see there's lots of detail here for portrait work. And one final shot of Loki, even at, large apertures, we can see just a lot of fine detail that is there. Just good color rendition. This is, I think, one of Sony's best sensors that I've seen, particularly coming in one of their cameras that's not priced at the top tier.
So really, at the end of the day, there is not a lot that I feel is worthy of criticism on the A7 IV. There are some things that I don't love still. I mean, it has this huge capacity for its focus system and deep buffers, but of course, the limitation of the viewfinder experience and the blackout and, not being able to get kind of, real good tracking as far as your actual visual process of engaging with the subject, that's a letdown, but they created market separation. And so if you want a dedicated sports camera, you look at an A9 or the Alpha 1. So I get what they're doing there. You could nitpick and say that the viewfinder resolution and the LCD screen resolution should be better still, but the point is that they are improved from previous iterations of the camera. I don't love the fact that there is a crop factor at 4K 60, but we finally moved beyond 4K 30 in the lineup, and so we have a whole lot more different options when it comes to the video performance as we've detailed. So at the end of the day, the list of strengths of this camera is a very long one, and you would see that if you look at, I always break down pros and cons at the end of my text reviews, and the list of pros for this camera is huge while the list of cons is very minimal. Because in my time with the camera, there's been a lot that I've loved, very little that I've disliked. And so yes, it has moved upscale in terms of its price point, $2,500 relative to around $2,000 for the A7 III, but you're also, I think, getting a whole lot more camera for your money. And I also think that Sony is maybe doing a little bit better job of creating some market separation for what will be their actual entry-level full-frame camera, be it the A7C, a successor, or even something else. Whereas there's been some muddying of the waters between a camera like the A7C and the A7 III. And I think that this market distinction is actually going to be a good one. And the reality is that this is a lot of camera for $2,500 US. I'm Dustin Abbott, and you have to look in the description down below. You can see a link to my full text review as mentioned. There's also links to the image gallery, some buying links if you'd like to purchase one of these from various retailers. Also linkage there to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to purchase channel merchandise. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.